What if one night you got on a bus that never reached its destination, and every person inside was already dead, including you? Stay with this story, because by the end, you'll realize this ride was never meant to bring anyone home. On a cold, silent night, something strange happened at an empty bus stop that most people avoid after dark. There were no witnesses, no cameras, and no clear explanation for what was about to begin. The only thing later remembered was that a man was seen standing alone, waiting for a bus that was not supposed to exist. Arman stood under a flickering streetlight, checking his phone again and again. It was nearly midnight. The last regular bus had already passed, and the road around him felt unusually still. Even the distant noise of the city seemed to have disappeared. The air was cold, and each breath formed a faint cloud in front of his face. He considered walking home, but the streets were long and empty, and something about the silence made him feel uneasy. Then, without warning, he heard it. A low, heavy engine sound echoed from the darkness at the end of the road. Arman looked up. Out of the black distance, a large, old bus slowly appeared. Its headlights were dim, barely lighting the ground in front of it. The metal body looked worn and dirty, as if it had been traveling for years without ever stopping. The number on the front was faded and hard to read. The bus pulled up right in front of him and stopped. The doors opened with a long, painful creak that broke the silence of the night. Arman hesitated. He did not remember seeing this route before. No other cars passed. No people stood nearby. It felt like the entire world had gone quiet just for this moment. Inside, he could see a few passengers already sitting. They were still and silent, their faces hard to make out in the dim yellow light. No one spoke, no one moved, yet the bus was clearly running, waiting. Arman stepped closer and looked toward the driver. A man sat behind the wheel, wearing a dark cap pulled low over his face. His hands rested on the steering wheel, completely still. "Does this go to the city?" Arman asked carefully. There was no reply, not even a nod. For a moment, Arman felt a strange urge to step back. Something didn't feel right. The silence inside the bus felt heavy, almost unnatural. But the cold wind behind him pushed him forward. Slowly, he climbed the steps and entered. The moment his foot touched the floor, the doors slammed shut behind him. And that was when he realized not a single passenger inside had turned to look at him. The first thing Arman noticed was the silence. Not the normal quiet of a late-night bus, but a deep, heavy silence that felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. As the bus moved forward, the low hum of the engine filled the space, yet none of the passengers made a single sound. He slowly walked down the narrow aisle, his footsteps echoing softly against the metal floor. The dim yellow lights above flickered, casting moving shadows across the faces of the people sitting on both sides. One man stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees, completely still. A woman sat by the window, her head slightly tilted, her eyes open but empty. Arman chose a seat near the middle, his heart beating faster than before. Something felt deeply unsettling. He told himself they were just tired, maybe returning home after a long day. But as seconds passed, the strange feeling grew stronger. No one blinked. No one shifted. No one even seemed to breathe. Arman leaned forward, glancing at the woman sitting across from him. Her face looked pale under the weak light, her skin almost gray. Her lips were slightly open, frozen in place. He cleared his throat quietly, trying to break the tension. "Excuse me," he said gently. There was no response. He waited, expecting her to turn or react, but she didn't move at all. The bus suddenly rolled over a small bump in the road. The woman's head slowly turned toward him, but the rest of her body stayed perfectly still. Her eyes met his, wide and lifeless like glass. Arman felt a chill spread through his chest. He leaned back quickly, his breath catching in his throat. That was when he realized he wasn't the only one being watched. One by one, the other passengers began to move, not their bodies, only their heads. Slowly, unnaturally, they turned toward him at the same time. Their eyes locked on him, filled with a deep sadness that felt older than time. Arman's hands started to shake. Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice barely steady. From the back of the bus, a small voice answered. A young boy sat alone near the last seat, staring straight at him. His face was pale, his eyes dark and tired. "You shouldn't be here," the boy whispered. Arman swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" The boy's lips trembled slightly as he spoke again. "No one gets on this bus and leaves." And as the bus continued moving through the empty night, Arman began to feel something even more terrifying. The passengers weren't just watching him, they were waiting. Arman's fear turned into panic the moment he rushed toward the front of the bus. The boy's words echoed in his mind again and again. "No one gets on this bus and leaves." The sound of the engine grew louder, deeper, as if the bus itself was alive and feeding on his fear. He grabbed the back of a seat to steady himself as the bus suddenly picked up speed. "Stop the bus!" he shouted, his voice shaking. "I need to get off right now!" The driver did not react. Arman moved closer, his hands trembling as he reached for the driver's shoulder. The air near the front felt colder than the rest of the bus, sharp enough to make his skin sting. For a brief second, he hesitated. Something inside him warned him not to touch the driver. But he did. The moment his fingers brushed the driver's shoulder, the man's head slowly turned. Arman stepped back, his breath leaving his body in a silent gasp. There was no face. Where the driver's face should have been, there was only darkness. No eyes, no nose, just an empty black space that seemed to pull in the dim light around it. The cap still rested on his head, but beneath it was nothing human. Arman stumbled backward, nearly falling. His heart pounded so loudly it felt like it would burst. The bus suddenly sped up even more, the engine roaring as if it were racing towards something unseen. He turned toward the windows, desperate to understand where they were. But the city was gone. The street lights had disappeared. The buildings had vanished. Outside was only endless darkness, stretching in every direction.
The road ahead seemed to go on forever, with no turns, no signs, and no other vehicles. Then he noticed movement. Figures were running beside the bus. At first, they were only shadows, keeping pace in the darkness. But as Arman pressed his hand against the cold glass, he could see them clearly. Thin, pale figures moved quickly, their arms stretched toward the windows. Their mouths were wide open, as if they were screaming, but no sound reached inside. One of the passengers behind him finally spoke, his voice weak and heavy with sorrow. "We tried to run too." Arman slowly turned around. The man who spoke stared at the floor, his face tired and empty. "We were like you, confused, afraid. We thought it was just a normal ride." Arman's throat felt dry. "What happened to you?" The man lifted his eyes, and for a moment they looked full of deep pain. "We never found the end of the road." The bus kept moving faster, deeper into the darkness, and Arman suddenly realized something terrifying. If there was no end to the road, where was the bus taking them?
The bus came to a sudden stop, so sharply that Arman almost lost his balance. The engine went silent, and for the first time since he had stepped inside, there was complete stillness. No sound, no movement, just a heavy, suffocating quiet that made his ears ring. The doors slowly opened with a long, tired creak. Outside, there was nothing. No streetlights, no buildings, no road signs, only endless darkness, thick and deep like a wall standing just beyond the steps. Arman leaned forward, trying to see where they had stopped, but it felt as if the world itself had disappeared. Then, one by one, the passengers began to stand. Their movements were slow and stiff, like people who had forgotten how to walk. The woman who had been staring out the window rose first. Her eyes remained open and empty as she stepped into the aisle. Others followed silently, forming a quiet line toward the door. No one spoke. No one looked at Arman. As the first passenger stepped down into the darkness, something terrifying happened. Her body began to fade, not all at once, but slowly, like smoke disappearing into the air. Within seconds, she was gone. Arman felt a chill run through his entire body. The next person stepped off and vanished the same way. One after another, they walked into the darkness and disappeared without a sound, as if they were being taken somewhere beyond the world he knew. Arman moved toward the door, hope rising inside him. Maybe this was his chance to escape. Maybe if he stepped off, he could return home. But the moment he reached the front, his legs suddenly felt heavy. It was as if something invisible was holding him back. He tried again, pushing forward, but his body refused to move. "Don't," a soft voice said beside him. Arman turned. The young boy stood there again, looking up at him with sad, knowing eyes. "Why can't I leave?" Arman asked, his voice filled with fear. The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and pointed toward the window. Arman followed his finger and looked at his reflection in the glass. His breath stopped. His face looked different. His skin had turned pale, almost colorless. The life in his eyes seemed to be fading. He pressed his hand against the window, and it felt cold, too cold.
"I don't understand," Arman whispered. "I'm still alive." The boy's expression grew even sadder. "You got on at midnight. That means the bus chose you." Arman shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "No, that's not possible." But as he tried to take a deep breath, he realized something that made his heart drop. He couldn't feel his chest move. He couldn't feel his heartbeat. And slowly, a terrifying question formed in his mind. If he wasn't alive anymore, then what had he become?
The bus jolted forward again, its engine low and throbbing like a heartbeat in the darkness. Arman's body felt heavier than ever, as if every movement required an impossible effort. He tried to speak, to warn someone, anyone, but his voice had vanished. His mouth opened, but only silence emerged. The truth hit him with icy clarity. He was no longer alive. He was a shadow of what he had been, trapped between life and death, tethered to the bus that had claimed him. The bus slowed, lights flickering once before stabilizing. The doors opened, and the faint smell of damp earth and night air drifted inside. Arman realized with growing horror that the bus had returned to a place he knew all too well, his own familiar bus stop. He could almost hear the hum of the city beyond the darkness, the ordinary world that seemed so close, yet impossibly out of reach. But he wasn't stepping off. He couldn't. His hands were pale and lifeless, his feet frozen to the floor. And then he saw her. A young woman stood at the door, hesitating as she looked at the bus. Fear and confusion were written across her face. She clutched her bag tightly and glanced around as if sensing something deeply wrong. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she stepped onto the bus. The doors closed behind her with a metallic click that resonated far too long in the empty interior. Arman tried to move toward her, to warn her, to tell her what he had learned too late, but he could not. He was trapped in his own body, invisible to her, as if he had been erased from the world. The woman slid into a seat across from him, breathing quickly, her eyes wide with unease. She looked directly at him. Her gaze met his empty eyes, and for a brief moment it seemed she sensed something, a presence that shouldn't be there. She shivered and asked in a trembling voice, "Is this bus going to the city?" Arman opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. No warning, no scream, no words, only the unrelenting, suffocating silence of the bus. The driver, still faceless and motionless, started the engine. The bus lurched forward, swallowing the light outside, moving back into the infinite darkness. The young woman gripped her seat, unaware that the moment she had stepped inside had sealed her fate. Arman realized with a sinking, hopeless clarity that the cycle had begun again. The bus had chosen its next passenger, and now he was nothing more than a witness, trapped forever, powerless, watching the terror continue. Somewhere in the darkness, another shadow waited. Another life would soon vanish, and the bus would roll on.